Well, you're all very welcome here to this series of 4 talks on the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae. So the title of the talks are The Sexual Revolution and Humanae Vitae at 50. My name's Dr. Gaven Kerr. I'm the research officer for the Iona Institute NI. I work with my colleague, Tracy Harkin. She's not here at the minute. She's got something else on, but she'll be here next week, okay? So I'm going to be giving the first 3 lectures of this series, and then Tracy Harkin's going to be giving the final lecture of the series. I'll take you through what the program is over the next 4 weeks, okay, just to let you know how everything is going. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to take you through the context of Humanae Vitae, when it was written, what were the motivations for it being written, what the different sort of influences were on the Pope at the time that the encyclical was written, and why this was such an important church document of the 20th century. So we're going to have a look at that, we're going to go through it, and I'm going to leave time at the end if you have any questions, okay? So feel free, to come up with questions at the end. There's a wee paper going around, just, if you want to give your name and details and stuff, if you want to be kept up to date with information on the Iona Institute Northern Ireland, you can do that. So, everybody got a cup of tea? We're happy? We're comfortable? Okay. Sorry we don't have anything colder on an evening like this. Okay. So, the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae, it was written by Pope Paul VI, soon to be, well, he's blessed Pope Paul VI. He'll be canonized in October along with Oscar Romero. Okay, so he'll be in the Roman calendar there. There he is there. That's Paul VI there. Okay. This was an encyclical. It was written and was published on the 29th of July, 1968. So this July then will be 50 years after the encyclical. And it came just 3 years after the closing of the Second Vatican Council. Now, we've all heard of the Second Vatican Council, have we? Yeah. We've all read the documents, maybe? I hope so. Yeah. Oh, they're a great read. Page turners. Now, these dates, for whenever this document came out, these dates are significant. Okay, so the document came out in 1968, just 3 years after the council. The reason why these dates are significant is because in one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, the nature of Christian marriage and the Catholic view towards marriage is addressed. And towards the end of Gaudium et Spes, there is repeated the Church's traditional teaching against artificial contraception. That's in note 51, the Church's traditional teaching against that. But what had happened about 4 or 5 years before that is that a new form of contraception became available and became widespread, which was the contraceptive pill. Now, traditionally, the Church's teaching on contraception was against barrier methods of contraception, and we'll see why the Church traditionally held that view against barrier methods of contraception, something to put a barrier in the way there to prevent contraception. But the contraceptive pill didn't really seem to fall under a barrier method. It wasn't a barrier method. It didn't put something in place to stop contraception, and so there was this issue then, is it a legitimate form of contraception that could be used by Catholics? Gaudium et Spes, note 51, addresses this issue, and in the footnote, it reserves judgment on the issue, and it says, look, given the advances in new scientific technologies around this issue, we will await for a further magisterial document on the matter. The Second Vatican Council finishes. 3 years later, that magisterial document comes out addressing the issue, which was Humanae Vitae. Okay, so it was the availability of the contraceptive pill that spurred on the writing of Humanae Vitae, especially given what is said here in Gaudium et Spes. If you ever want to have a wee read of Gaudium et Spes, it's one of the best documents of the Second Vatican Council to read. So if you're going to start with any of them, Gaudium et Spes is probably the best one. Okay, so Paul VI felt that there had to be an encyclical on this matter, and so he wrote this encyclical and published it in 1968. All right. In this series of talks, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this encyclical, okay, because it's 50 years after it. We're going to be looking at the historical context of the encyclical Humanae Vitae. That's what we're going to do this evening. Then next week, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty stuff. We're going to get down to the interesting stuff. That's when we're going to look at contraception and sex. Okay, so that'll be the interesting evening, so we might have a full house that night, okay? Bring somebody along for it, it'll be interesting. That's what we're going to look at next week, and we're going to see why Pope Paul VI thought that, that artificial contraception, contraceptive pill, or barrier methods are not legitimate for use in any sort of sexual relation. After that, there'll be our third talk, and we're going to have a look at the vision of marriage and the family that Pope Paul VI had in mind whenever he was writing Humanae Vitae. So very famously, Pope Paul VI was reading a book called Love and Responsibility at the time that he was writing Humanae Vitae. And we all know who wrote Love and Responsibility? Young Polish man named Karol Wojtyła, okay, later to be Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, he made it the focus of his pontificate to focus on the philosophy and the theology of marriage and the family, and particularly with his theology of the body. So if any of you have ever been through the theology of the body, man and woman, he created them, big book. Well, that was preceded by this book, Love and Responsibility, which Pope Paul VI was reading at the time. So we're going to have a look at that vision of marriage and the family in our third talk in this series, and that'll give us this broad overview of the approach that Paul VI was taking. Then if any of you have read Humanae Vitae, it's an interesting document to read, very short. You know, it's not as long as some of the lengthier encyclicals. At the end of Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI makes a number of prophecies, well, so-called prophecies, as to what will happen and what the world and society will look like if artificial contraception is made widely available and its uptake is widely available. And he makes these various prophecies. And the interesting question then that a number of people ask today, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after is, did those prophecies come true? Okay, was there any truth to those prophecies? Was he right in predicting that this is what would happen to people and their relationships with each other if artificial contraception became the norm amongst Catholics and then in wider society? And so Tracy is going to take that session. That'll be our fourth and final session. And so by the end of it, you should have a good sort of overview of what the document says, what the context of the document is, what the vision of marriage and the family is, and how things ended up after the publication of the document. It's one of the most notorious Catholic documents of the 20th century, just to let you know, okay, just to warn you before you get into it. All right, so the motivation for this, apologies for the size of this. We tried to fix it and, you know, get it ready. All this material will be going up on our website, the Iona Institute NI website anyway. You'll be able to get access to it. And David here at the back is filming this, so the videos will be going up online for you. But I'll talk you through it, ease you in gently to it. Okay, this is a pivotal document in the 20th century and 20th century church history, Humanae Vitae. And along with the various documents of the Second Vatican Council and various popes that preceded the Second Vatican Council, it really does merit being read by those who take the issue of marriage and the family seriously. Also, this year, 2018, it marks the 50th anniversary, okay, and it's always nice to celebrate an anniversary of something like this, you know, which really had a profound impact. And we tried to make it a bit bigger. We weren't able to. Yeah, our technical person. Yeah, we footed with the lights as well. We tried our best. This is as big as we can get it. Sorry about that. All right. Okay, the material will be going up on our website as well. Okay, so if you just want to sit back and relax, and you can listen to me instead of, you know, reading the text. I don't know which you would prefer. So, not only that it's the 50th anniversary and that it was a pivotal document, it shocked many people when it was published. So if anybody was maybe alive at the time whenever it was published or in the aftermath, this was very shocking to a lot of people. A lot of people found that they couldn't accept it. A lot of people completely rejected the document. I brought a few books with me this evening just on that issue. One of them is by a lady called Janet Smith, and she brought out this book, Why Humanae Vitae Was Right. Okay, so I think you'll know what that book is about, Why Humanae Vitae Was Right. This is a big 600-page book, okay, big book. And so she defends the truth of Humanae Vitae. She thinks that it was correct and that it is a magisterial document and it is binding on those who consider themselves Catholics to follow the teaching of Humanae Vitae. But on the other hand, at the time, this man here, Charles Curran, brought out, well, this book and several other books. This is an edited volume on contraception that he brought out by a number of thinkers, and there are several of them, all of them are Catholic actually, many of them are clergy, and they argued that Humanae Vitae is not a magisterial document and that Catholics can legitimately dissent from the document, okay, from the teachings of the document. This was the controversy at the time after Humanae Vitae was published, because a lot of people just found it shocking We're going to see why they found it shocking, given the different influences that were on Paul VI. But these are just, some of the voices which came out after Humanae Vitae, which kind of framed the whole discussion and its dissemination. So 50 years later, we've got a wee bit of a historical distance from that, where we can kind of, step back and see where we stand with these issues. A number of people believed that the Pope would permit the legitimacy of the contraceptive pill in particular. Maybe not barrier methods of contraception, but they thought he would allow for the contraceptive pill. So when he brought out this document and he said, well, look, this, is just as illegitimate as barrier methods of contraception, people just found this completely shocking, and immediately there was a reaction to it. So it'll be interesting to find out why that happened. It met with a lot of opposition, not only within the Catholic world, but also within the secular world as well. Okay, so within the secular world, you had second wave feminism, which we're going to have a look at. And second wave feminism, especially influenced by the writings of a lady called Simone de Beauvoir. Have we heard of her? She was Jean-Paul Sartre's girlfriend, okay? And out of the two of them, I think she was the more interesting author. She wrote a book called The Second Sex. And she held that the reason why women face, oppression, sexism, misogyny, and so forth, is not because of social, cultural, political reasons. It's because of their actual biological nature. And one feature of their biological nature, their reproductive faculty, entails that they are taken to be the second sex, that they're inferior, precisely because they don't have control over their reproductive nature. So women will only be free from sexism and misogyny and so forth if they can take control of the reproductive faculty. This is what de Beauvoir argued, and this influenced second wave feminism. And that took root in the 60s, especially in America, that idea that women need to take control of their bodily faculties, especially their reproductive faculty, otherwise they wouldn't be free. So to oppose that is to oppose women's liberation. Okay, Pope Paul VI opposed that in Humanae Vitae, and so within the secular world it was taken to be that Pope Paul VI opposed women's liberation, and you can't get much worse than that, okay, within the secular world. So that was, another sort of those issues that was occurring at the time, 1968, when this came out. Now, resistance to Humanae Vitae was fueled in two respects. First one we've mentioned here is this notion of feminism, that women can only be independent, gain a certain type of liberation if they're independent of their reproductive capacity, if they can take control of it and determine it for themselves. The second resistance to Humanae Vitae came from a genuine lack of knowledge of any sort of legitimate means for limiting pregnancies within a marriage. There were faithful women who weren't influenced by de Beauvoir, who didn't dissent from the Pope, who believed in the Pope's magisterial teaching, but still wanted to practice what Pope Paul VI called responsible parenthood, but they didn't know how to do it. They weren't aware of the various methods of natural family planning as we are today, and so they were genuinely concerned that if they can't get access to contraception, they're in a state of desperation. What can they do? They want to lead happy and fulfilling marriages. Okay, certain activities are involved in happy and fulfilling marriages, but they didn't want to get pregnant. And Pope Paul VI recognises that in the encyclical. He devotes a whole section of the encyclical to that issue. And so there was a lack of knowledge on their part, and that fueled some of the resistance to Humanae Vitae. So all in all, this document creates quite a stir, it really does. It was really reported upon, not only within the Catholic world, but within the secular world as well. It's one of the most important papal documents of the 20th century. So it's a good thing that we're here, to have a wee look through it and, see what it's about. So how are we doing? Are we okay? Yeah, getting on? Right. So what was the church teaching on contraception prior to 1968? Prior to the publication of Humanae Vitae? Up until the 20th century, all Christians rejected contraception, okay? It wasn't taken to be a legitimate form of regulating births within a marriage, so all Christians just rejected contraception. Catholicism, all mainline Protestant congregations, as well as Eastern Orthodoxy, they all rejected it. But in 1930, with the Lambeth Conference, the Anglican Communion, it permitted contraception in some circumstances. It sought to permit that in various circumstances. And in 1958, it stated that the responsibility of deciding the number of children in a marriage was laid on a couple's conscience by God. So if a couple conscientiously thought this through in prayer and in discussion with each other and felt the contraception was the way to go, then it was legitimate, okay? So the authorities within the Anglican Communion couldn't say to them, well, no, this is illegitimate. This puts you at odds with what you believe in as an Anglican. And today, all mainline Protestant communions accept contraception. Okay, so the only Christian the Catholic Church is the only Christian organisation which wholly opposes all forms of artificial contraception. The Eastern Orthodox Church, it's interesting, some branches of it do allow for contraception under this notion, what they call economia or economy, which is somewhat like this conscience clause here that the Anglicans talk about. And then there's other forms of Eastern Orthodoxy which are quite, strict on the matter as well, just like the Catholic Church. But pre-1968, the Catholic Church, held that all forms of artificial contraception were unacceptable, and up until the 20th century, all sort of Christian denominations held that as well. And then things kind of changed in the 20th century. Now, why does the Catholic Church reject contraception? Or at least pre-1968, why did the Catholic Church reject contraception? So the contraceptive pill starts coming in 1960. Okay, so it's allowed to start being used in 1960. And the question then is, how does the Catholic Church address this? But prior to that, it did have this rejection of contraception. And in order to consider why the Catholic Church rejected contraception, we need to consider two influences or two reasons or principles that it took in approach to the issue. The first is the biblical witness. Okay, so Catholic teaching always has to go back to the biblical witness in some shape or form. And the second is sacred tradition, i.e. the tradition of the theologians of the Church, the fathers and the doctors. That's your St. Thomas Aquinas, your St. Augustine, St. Basil the Great, those people. Okay, what they took from Scripture and moulded into doctrine, which is taken to be acceptable for Catholics to believe. Okay, so if we look at the biblical witness first, there are two principal places in the Bible that is taken to reject contraception. The first is in Genesis, chapter 38, and this is the passage. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. The Old Testament is full of stuff like this. It really is interesting like that, This isn't the, this isn't the under-18s version, okay? So, what this is known as is coitus interruptus. That's the Latin term for it, coitus interruptus. And what it means is that when certain measures are taken so that impregnation doesn't occur. So in this case, withdrawal or something like that. He spilled the semen on the ground. So one takes certain measures, one interrupts intercourse so that impregnation does not occur. And this, according to Genesis, is taken to be wicked in the Lord's sight. Then Deuteronomy 23, no one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. Now what that's interpreted to mean is that when you have some sort of artificial sterilization of the male, this action is one which is envisaged by the author of Deuteronomy to be so serious that one can't enter into God's assembly or association if one has done this. Okay, so any form of artificial sterilization is taken to distance one from God. It's taken to be an act so serious. In both these cases, there's some sort of recognition here by the biblical authors of the goodness of what's called the fecundity of the human beings, of two human beings together. If we read John Paul II, going right back to Genesis, go forth and multiply. This is something that God asks human beings to do as something which will make them holy, as a divine work. So to take steps to reject that is taken to be a disobeying of one of God's commands, and so it's taken to be sinful to frustrate that natural faculty that one has. That's the biblical witness to the matter, okay? So this is what the theologians of the church, the doctors and the fathers, are reading, and they're trying to figure out, what could the author of Scripture have in mind here? What vision of human beings and human relations could they have in mind? So that's where we turn then to the theologians. So the fathers and the doctors of the church. So it was their view, and their consistent view, their position of these fathers and doctors, who commented on the matter at least, that men and women, man and woman, are created as complementary opposites of the same species. So they complement one another. There's something about them. Woman has something that man doesn't have, and man has something that woman doesn't have. And when they come together, they are completed in a certain way. There's some sort of completion that makes them whole. That wholeness in their coming together unifies them in a certain respect. And that unity then, that unity of their coming together, takes on a very real physical manifestation in offspring. Okay. Now, the fathers and the doctors of the church, in having that vision where men and women come together and are united to each other, they're incomplete in themselves and they're completed in uniting themselves to each other, comes from a very odd sort of source. It's there in Scripture, but it's also to be found in a Greek philosopher called Plato. Have any of you heard of Plato? Okay. Plato wrote this work. Plato wrote many works. He's brilliant. He's wonderful. Okay, if you want to begin some philosophy, read Plato. Okay, because he's amazing. I prefer him to Aristotle. Okay, maybe that's a sin. Okay, but I prefer Plato to Aristotle. Plato wrote a work called The Symposium, which is a brilliant work. And in the Symposium, Socrates, who is the mouthpiece of Plato, Socrates and all his friends, they've been up all night drinking. Okay, they've been up all night drinking. One of these Greek drinking sessions, they're drinking wine. All right? And the next day, they're not feeling too well. Okay? So they're all feeling a bit sick. So maybe that's happened to you once or twice in your lives. You know, you've maybe stayed up a wee bit too late with your friends and drank a lot of wine. You feel a bit sick the next day. Now, the first thing that you do the next day, when you're feeling a bit sick from too much wine, some people would have another drink. You know, hair of the dog. We've all heard of that. Yeah. We're not all as innocent as... Okay. Certainly, you know, back in my student days, you know, you had a hangover, you know, it was a pint of Guinness, you know, and a fry or something like that. What do these Greeks do in the Symposium? What are they going to do? How are they going to cure their hangover? Well, they just admit we can't drink anymore, so they decide to read poetry. That's their hangover cure, poetry. Okay. So they start to read poetry and reflect on the nature of love and beauty. And in this, as they're talking about the nature of love and beauty, Socrates talks about this myth, okay? He expresses this myth about how he believes man and woman are, what their natures are. And this myth comes under all sorts of various names. I like the name, the myth of the hermaphrodites, okay? Because Socrates says, imagine men and women, originally they were created perfect, okay? They were hermaphroditic, okay? The male and female were both together. They had 2 heads, 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 sets of genitals, okay? Then they weren't separate from each other. It was just one individual. They were so perfect that they thought they were better than God. Well, the God, you know, that the Greeks believed in, Zeus. And so Zeus decided to punish them. So Zeus split them in half. And what you had was 2 individuals, okay? 1 male and 1 female, now with 1 head, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 set of genitals, but they were opposed to each other, and they were constantly, as male and female of the species, striving to reunite to each other to regain that initial state of perfection. Plato says, well, Socrates says, but Plato's saying through the mouthpiece of Socrates, this is what men and women are like. This is why men and women marry each other, because they are opposite sex and they're striving to complement each other and bring each other to fulfillment and unite with each other in that way. They're trying to achieve that sort of perfection. And that perfection brings about some sort of physical manifestation, which is offspring. Offspring are the physical manifestation of the unity that occurs in the sexual act for Plato. The fathers and doctors of the church, they're all reading Plato. After St. Augustine read Plato and thought he was great, and it, you know, took St. Augustine away from the heresy of Manichaeism, everybody started reading Plato after this, and the Platonists. And that vision of man and woman influenced how these people read the scriptures, and in particularly read Genesis. So they see in Genesis this notion to go forth and multiply as this inbuilt desire of man and woman created by God to come together, to unite with each other as complementary opposites, and to produce a physical manifestation of their unity, which is offspring. Okay, that was the vision of marriage that the church fathers and doctors had. So, men and women come together to create new life. They form a relationship, the heart of which is the creation of new life, and that's the married relationship. That's the notion of marriage that the church adopts. And their doing that is a participation in the personal unity of the Trinity. Because man and woman, when they come together and are unified in marriage and in the sexual act, they become one in the sexual act, but they're still 2 distinct persons, okay? Just as the Trinity, you know, well, it's 3 distinct persons, but it's still a unity of the essence of the Godhead. You have 3 distinct persons, distinct from each other, but united in the essence of Godhood. And in the creating of new life that man and woman can engage in, that's a participation in God's creativity. Only God can create new life, and when man and woman come to do that, they're participating in something which is divine. So the married state and the coming together in sexual intercourse is seen to be something divine by the fathers and doctors of the church. And when they take these measures to unite themselves to each other, they're doing something divine. They're doing something which is good and noble and divine. So the fathers and the doctors inferred any efforts to frustrate that would be taken to trying to undermine some sort of divine activity, trying to work against God. And if you're doing something which isn't divine, well, you're sinning. Okay? So any measures to frustrate the natural unity of a husband and wife in the sexual act is taken to be something sinful. And so the fathers and doctors then rejected it as something which is illegitimate for Catholics to engage in. Now, next week we're going to look in depth at the reasoning against contraception that Pope Paul VI gives us. That gives you a bit of a taster of it. Paul VI takes it in a slightly different direction, but that's the framework that he's working from. Already we're seeing here that within the tradition of the church, contraception disrupts the unity of man and woman in marriage. If we look at barrier methods, it literally puts a barrier in place so they're not united. They're disunited in their sexual engagements with each other when barrier methods are in place. The problem then in the 1960s is, what about the contraceptive pill? There is no barrier there, so there is no disunity. There still seems to be unity there. So everything seems to be fulfilled that the fathers and the doctors thought was needed for marriage. And so we have this problem with the contraceptive pill, which Pope Paul VI is going to address next week for us. Okay, so the main reasons then for rejection of contraception is that it undermines the creativity of the marriage union because contraception is there in place precisely to stop procreation from occurring, and it creates this disunity between man and woman. So within a Christian context then, contraception is contrary to the divine nature of marriage as the fathers and the doctors saw it. And that was the tradition of the church right up until the 20th century. That was the universal Christian tradition right up till the 20th century. If you have a look through Janet Smith's book, you know, she goes through Luther, Calvin, all the reformers and what they have to say on contraception as well. Some very, very extreme things, you know, not as extreme as what the Catholic doctors said, but still, you know, rejecting contraception there. So that was the position of all Christians till the 20th century. Then things changed a wee bit in the 20th century. So we have the contraceptive pill, the discovery of the contraceptive pill and the development of it, and then it's, you know, being unrolled in the 1960s. Okay, that's not a barrier method, as we said. So it doesn't appear to sever any unity between man and woman. It doesn't place a barrier in the way of reproduction. Not only that, in the 20th century, we have this very popular principle of ethical reasoning which comes to the fore. This is called the principle of totality. A lot of moral theologians in the 20th century were committed to this notion of the principle of totality. And the principle of totality is this: so long as the majority of the marriage acts within a marriage are legitimate marriage acts which don't use contraception, then those marriage acts which do use contraception when you want to exercise responsible parenthood are quite all right. Because if we take the marriage as a whole, the married couple do not intend for it to be barren. Okay, they're not always going to be taking measures to prevent children occurring. They are going to let children occur at some point. So when they do take measures to stop children occurring, well, there's no problem with that, so long as overall, or the total vision of marriage, the whole marriage, is one in which they will welcome children at some point. That's the principle of totality, and it was applied in a lot of different ethical situations. It's taken from a quote from Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says, "Just as one swallow does not make a summer, so too does not one good or bad act determine one's life." So just because you do one good act, that doesn't make you a good person or mean that you're living a good life. Just because you've done one bad act, that doesn't make you a bad person or mean you're living a bad life. But if you lead a life of consistently good acts or consistently bad acts, then you're living a good and bad life. Okay, so believers in the principle of totality thought, well, that applies to contraception then. Just as if we're living our married life, you know, most of the time we're not using contraception, but those times where we do, where we want to exercise responsible parenthood, well, there's no problem with that. So believers in the principle of totality thought. So Pope Paul VI has to deal with this, and he does deal with it in Humanae Vitae. He has to deal with the issue that the contraceptive pill is not a barrier method and so doesn't fall under the traditional teaching against contraception. And also he has to deal with a number of moral theologians urging him to accept the principle of totality, Catholic theologians urging him to accept this principle and to allow for artificial contraception. Okay, so the pressure is on Pope Paul VI to deal with this, and he has to do something about it. Okay, now, on a number of occasions, Pope Paul VI reaffirmed the traditional teaching on marriage and the family. He did this on a number of occasions, and as I said, he was reading Love and Responsibility by John Paul II. Well, he wasn't John Paul II in 1968, but by Karl Wojtyła when he was writing Humanae Vitae. So, in Love and Responsibility, it's a brilliant book for the life. If you love your sanity, don't sit and try to read it cold, okay? It is unless you're a philosophy grad or theology graduate or been through seminary. Really, it is a very difficult book, extremely difficult. Pope John Paul II's academic writing is just up here. I can't understand it, okay? But Love and Responsibility, he articulates in that a very contemporary 20th century vision of marriage, sexual intercourse, the family, and he draws this from the Church's theological tradition, mainly Thomas Aquinas, but also a lady called Edith Stein. You might have heard of Edith Stein. She's St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Okay, she was a Carmelite nun who was, she was murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz. Very interesting woman, okay, very famous philosopher. Fellow student with Martin Heidegger, another 20th century philosopher. Heidegger went off and became a Nazi. Edith Stein went off and became a Carmelite and was murdered by the Nazis. And they were both fellow students together. Okay. John Paul II really felt highly about Edith Stein, and he uses a lot of her thought within his writings. So if that kind of, gets you interested, Love and Responsibility, but if you appreciate your sanity, try, stay away from it. Okay, so we'll let this latecomer at the back just come in. There's a seat up at the front up here. Okay. Right up here at the front, Brett, right here. So, John Paul II, very much influenced by Edith Stein and Thomas Aquinas. Paul VI, in reading Love and Responsibility while he's writing Humanae Vitae, he's thoroughly rooted then in the traditional theology of the Church. Aquinas, Stein, all the doctors and fathers of the Church. But that's the Pope, that's Paul VI, that's what he's reading. When it comes to writing a papal encyclical, the Pope is informed by a number of different individuals from what are called commissions. Commissions are set up, and these are made up of groups of experts who are well informed on the matter at hand, and they will inform the Pope, okay, of what they think. They will give the expert opinion. The Pope will take it and read it, go through it, discuss it with his theological advisors. Theological advisors to the Pope, by the way, tend to be Dominicans, okay, just to point out, I'm a Dominican, so theological advisors tend to be Dominicans, just to point that out. The Pope's confessors tend to be Jesuits. His theological advisors tend to be Dominicans. Okay, I don't know what that says about religious orders, all right? But the Pope at the minute was a Jesuit, okay? So I wonder who his advisors are. The Pope he takes the details of these commissions, he reads the expert opinions, and then he will settle the matter at hand in writing the encyclical. So he gets his influences from the commissions that he sets up. Now, the commission that was set up for writing Humanae Vitae, okay, the actual commission was set up long before the encyclical was written. It was set up before Paul VI was even Pope. Pope John the 23rd set up a commission in 1963 to study the question of birth control, given that the pill started to emerge in 1960. Okay, so 3 years after the pill starts to be promulgated, it's cleared for usage, Pope John the 23rd sets up this commission. So he was on the ball, okay? He realized that the contraceptive pill didn't fall under the traditional barrier methods of contraception, so didn't fall within the remit of the Church's condemnation of barrier methods, and so they needed to decide on the issue. So 1963, John the 23rd, he sets up this commission of 6 members, and then when the Second Vatican Council occurs, this was enlarged to 58 by Pope Paul VI. So John the 23rd, he thought 6 members were enough. Okay, Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI thinks, we'll add another 52 people to that. Okay, that'll make it easier. That'll make things a wee bit more straightforward if they weren't difficult enough. Gaudium et Spes, as we saw at the start, that drew attention to the issue of contraception, but it didn't settle it. Okay, so it says we've got these new technologies, but we'll wait for further magisterial teaching. After the council, in 1966, the commission was enlarged again. It was enlarged by another 16 members, bishops this time, bringing it to the grand total of 74. So they had 74 experts, clerics, bishops, lay people, married people, all commenting on the issue. I believe Karl Wojtyła also had an input on it. And they submitted their report to Paul VI. The majority of the commission, okay, 64 out of the 74 of the commission, okay, so the majority of it, urged Pope Paul VI to approve some form of contraception for married couples. Okay? That was in 1966. Okay? The majority of the commission urged Paul VI to approve contraception for married couples. Right. Karl Wojtyła was in the minority. He was one of the minority of 10 who says, no, don't do it. 2 years later, okay, so this was in 1966, 2 years later, in 1968, the Pope publishes Humanae Vitae, in which he rejects the majority opinion of the commission, and he holds that all forms of artificial contraception, barrier methods and hormonal methods, contraceptive pill, are to be rejected, and so that included the contraceptive pill. The question is, why? Why did he do that? Well, we're going to go into detail about that next week. That's next week's show, okay? So we'll find out why. This is the writing of the encyclical and what the pressures that were on him. The Pope didn't accept the majority opinion. He didn't see the reasons being offered by the majority of people on the commission as being enough to justify a change in the Church's theological position. Indeed, when we come to see the reasoning in the encyclical, he thinks that certain people have just misunderstood the Church's theology in this matter. And so as Pope, given that he has the authority to do so, he decides to reject the Commission's recommendation and follow the recommendation of the minority members not to make any sort of change. Now, he can do that, but he has to give a reason. He has to say why he's doing that. He can't just say, no, I'm not accepting this. He has to give some sort of reason, and we're going to look at those reasons next week when we look at the texts. And he addresses that issue of the principle of totality, okay, that if most of the marriage acts can be free from contraception and only some of them are contraceptive acts, then it's okay. He deals with that, okay, he treats of it. He's got a very lengthy note on that issue, as well as giving a whole account of what marriage should be like and what responsible parenthood should be like within the context of the Church's moral theology. Within the context of the Christian understanding of marriage and the family. Now, not only did Pope Paul VI have those pressures working on him from the Commission, from the majority of the Commission, suggesting that he legitimize some form of contraception, there were also external pressures as well. This was the 60s, okay? So if anybody's familiar with the 60s, you know, it's kind of, you know, a famous period in history, almost like the 80s. I think we skipped the 70s and then the 80s, my decade that I was born in, but the 60s were definitely an important decade in the 20th century. There was huge social and cultural change in the 80s. Casual sex. It has always been a feature of every human society. It has always been there in every human society. It's not something new with the 20th century. But it's always been the case that in human society, the activity of casual sex was always seen to be something that one ought not to engage in. Whilst that does occur, you know, we should do our best to encourage people not to do it and to try and educate people in forming, you know, long-term lasting relationships and everything. It wasn't seen as something that was virtuous, okay? It wasn't seen as a morally choice-worthy activity, casual sex. But with the 60s culture, the swinging 60s, this was inverted and the outlook just completely flip-sided, that casual sex was seen to be a virtuous activity, a choice-worthy activity, something that was good to engage in, and something which we really ought to engage in, or else we haven't lived, you know, a full and complete life. You know, we haven't enjoyed the university experience if we haven't engaged in all sorts of casual sex. It was seen as a virtuous thing, something that one ought to choose, and this would be a great thing to do, because it expressed a certain freedom of one's body, a freedom of one's sexuality, not subject to any sort of constraint. This was seen to be something good, okay, and liberating and wonderful in the 60s. So whilst casual sex has been there in human history, it hasn't always been seen as a virtue. It's only very recently that it is seen as a virtue. So what was previously a vice is now seen as some sort of virtuous behavior. Okay, this is a major pressure which is working on Paul VI, okay? He has to, you know, bring this encyclical out in 1968 within this culture where casual sex is seen to be something virtuous. And if you're going to have casual sex, well, you're going to have ways of dealing with the natural consequences of sex, not just illnesses, but also, you know, new life, which obviously isn't an illness. Along with that, okay, along with the perceived virtuous nature of casual sex, We have second wave feminism, which I already referred to. So second wave feminism, as I say, was inspired by Simone de Beauvoir. If you can, have a read of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. It's an excellent book. It really is. It's much better than Jean-Paul Sartre, Being and Nothingness. Okay, Simone de Beauvoir is actually interesting to read, even if I think she's wrong. Okay, it is interesting to read. So Simone de Beauvoir, she held that it's not until women completely liberate themselves from their biological nature that they'll be liberated, okay, and equal to men. It's women's biology which enslaves them, okay? They're enslaved to their biology, particularly to the reproductive system, and until they can gain control of that, they will never be free. So women are victims of sexism and misogyny and all the rest, not just because men are sexist and misogynistic and so forth. Men can't help being like that because men are the primary sex, according to de Beauvoir. Only when women break free of the shackles of their biology will they cease to be secondary and be primary along with men. Okay, so that's the narrative of the second sex. So in order to break free of that secondary status, they have to master this reproductive system that they're enslaved to, either through contraception or through abortion. Roe versus Wade, that was the law in the States which permitted abortion. That came in 1973. That was about 13 years after the contraceptive pill. So we need the contraceptive pill to free us from our secondary status. You know, well, not my secondary status, but women need it to free them from their secondary status, subject to their reproductive faculties. And then they need abortion if, you know, the contraceptive pill doesn't work. And only then will they be completely liberated. So women's liberation can only occur when they're more or less, you know, barren, okay, effectively barren, either through contraception or abortion. Any curtailment of women's access to contraception or indeed abortion, this is conspiring to keep women constrained to some sort of secondary status. So that narrative, that notion that, you know, if women can't have access to contraception and abortion, that it's a women's rights issue, that comes from Simone de Beauvoir and second wave feminism. And the whole principle is that only when women can break free of that biology will they themselves be free and have control over themselves. Men can have casual sex and they can enjoy all the good things in life without the consequences, but women can't. Okay, they do suffer the effects of casual sex, and so we need to kind of do something to stop that, to make them equal to men. So in order to be equal to men, contraception is a necessity. And God bless Pope Paul VI saying that, you know, no, contraception is not a good thing. The contraceptive pill is not legitimate for usage. So you can imagine the uproar when this came out in 1968, telling these women this. Not only that, okay, another pressure working on Pope Paul VI was that there was very little knowledge of any alternative to contraception for birth control. There was very, very little knowledge of any alternative, okay? What's now called the Billings method of natural family planning wasn't really investigated until round about this time, till round about the 60s and, you know, much after. So various natural family plannings really took off around the 60s and 70s and until they're at a stage where they're at today where we have much more knowledge of them. But at this time, there was very little knowledge, and in the encyclical, Pope Paul VI says, look, we will recommend, you know, we think it would be a good thing if, you know, those wise scientists, you know, engage more and more looking at more legitimate natural family planning methods. All barrier methods, they were deemed illegitimate. The contraceptive pill now with Humanae Vitae seemed to be illegitimate. And so there are a lot of women who are not influenced by second wave feminism, who do agree with the magisterial of the teaching of the church, who aren't part of the swinging 60s, who aren't engaged in casual sex, but who do want to exercise this responsible parenthood that Pope Paul VI talked about. What do they do? Where are they to go? Okay, so when they read this, they're thinking, oh, no, you know, what am I meant to do here? You know, we can't have any more children for very legitimate reasons. Next week, we're going to see some of the legitimate reasons for responsible parenthood, for why one can legitimately limit their family size. But they were thinking, you know, how are we meant to react to this? How are we meant to live a fulfilling marriage? So the fallout of it then was that there was a complete backlash after Humanae Vitae was published, given all these different influences, both within the Catholic world and outside the Catholic world. There was a lot of people within the church who were quite surprised at the encyclical, including those 10 dissenters of the commission, okay, who were in the minority, who says, no, keep it as it is, you know, keep the, you know, condemnation of contraception. They were very surprised when Pope Paul VI said, you know, all forms of contraception are illegitimate. The writer, I think he's a Jesuit writer, John Ford, he was speaking to Paul VI at the time, just before Humanae Vitae was written, and he said, so are you ready to, change church teaching and allow for contraception? And apparently Pope Paul VI turned to him and says, absolutely not. Okay, so a lot of people did think that this was going to happen. But then those who were represented by the majority of the commission, they thought, well, we're going to get some form of contraception here. This is going to be great. So when that didn't happen, there was immediate backlash within the church. Cardinal Sunens, he criticised the document for its lack of collegiality. We had a number of bishops all over the world saying, please allow for some form of contraception. Pope Paul VI says no in Humanae Vitae, and he gives reasons. We'll see the reasons, but ultimately he says no. And Sunens says, well, this doesn't show the collegiality which the Second Vatican Council talks about as a necessary feature of the Church. The Pope as bishop in a college of bishops with all his fellow bishops. So he attacks it, and in his attack of it, he's supported by some big names in Catholic theology, including Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner the Great, depending on what you think of Rahner, but he was a big name in Catholic theology of the time, and he agreed with Sunens. Well, look, this document is just not a collegial document. The Canadian bishops, they issued a statement at the time, and they said that one could in good conscience act against what the encyclical says. The Canadian bishops said that. You can in good conscience use contraception despite what Humanae Vitae says. Cardinal Martini said that Pope Paul VI was concealing the truth about the matters. He was literally concealing the truth. And then we saw this man here, Charles Kern. He brought out several publications, including this one here, this edited volume with a number of important thinkers in it, saying that one can, in good conscience, dissent from the teaching of Humanae Vitae. That was the reaction within the Catholic world, and there was all sorts of private and public opinions on the matter, as there still is today. Outside the Catholic world, well, you can imagine the reaction there. It was seen to be anti-woman. It was opposed to the very thing that finally, well, supposedly, would give women control over their fertility. Okay, so given this very strong second wave feminism, this was just an anti-woman document. It was ridiculous, according to these people within the secular world. It was met with dismay by those women who were, whilst faithful, they wanted to regulate their births, but they didn't know how to do that. And all in all, it didn't get a very welcome reception. And even now, when you talk to some people about Humanae Vitae, they just think, this is just a ridiculous document. We'll just pass over that. We like Fides et Ratio. That's a nice document. We'll read that. Maybe some of the other encyclicals of John Paul II. We like Laudato Si, Deus Caritas Est, that sort of thing. Encyclicals on the Rosary. But let's just, overlook Humanae Vitae, pretend it didn't happen. But it did happen. Okay, it's an important cyclical, and it's an important point in the history of the Church in the 20th century. Pope Paul VI is about to be made, he's about to be canonized in October, and he gives some solid reasons for holding that contraception is illegitimate. It cannot not to be used within the Catholic view of marriage. So what we're going to do next week, now that we're 50 years later, next week, we're going to look at those reasons put forth in the encyclical as to why he held that, and we're going to see what his arguments against all those dissenters were, this huge opposition that he had, and that's what we're going to do next week. So that's what I have for you this evening. You're free to ask any sorts of questions that you want. Some of them will probably be answered next week and the week after, but fire ahead and ask them anyway if you want, okay? And thanks for coming along on this lovely evening. All right, thank you.